Hey guys, it's Makeshift, and today I'm going to show you some tips on how to line up your stripes along a seam. So you're going to run into this situation a lot in plush making where you have a color transition that's going to run across a seam. So you see that this stripe here has gone across this middle seam here where it forms the side of the body and then the front of the body. So this stripe needs to continue onto this second pattern piece. And it can be tricky to line up these color changes right along the seam line, because if it didn't match up, then you would have either this orange color dipping down into the brown or vice versa. So this is a situation you'll run into a lot in plush making, so it's good to learn some tips on how to handle these color transitions along a seam line. Today I'm working with a pattern by Owl's Tea Party, which is a plush of the Great Serpent of Ronka from Final Fantasy XIV, which is a cute little striped worm creature. So this is perfect for showing you guys some tips on how to sew stripes together and to make sure that all the seams line up. If you'd like to make your own plush with this pattern, I'll go ahead and link the pattern in the description of this video. It is a free pattern as well. There's also an embroidery set included by a different artist called Dragon's Den, where they have a version where you embroider the face on and they also applique the stripes on instead of sewing it together, if that's something that interests you as well. So if you were developing your own pattern with stripes, the most important thing when developing that pattern is making sure that your stripes themselves line up exactly across the two pattern pieces. So this is the side of the plush and this is the front of the plush. So if I show you these two pattern pieces cut out, you can see on the side that they line up exactly. The length of the side where they meet is a perfect match. Making sure that your pattern exactly lines up on the edges is probably the most important step of this whole process, because if your pattern is off to begin with, you're never going to end up having your stripes line up along the seam in the very end. Now, this pattern is great and already does all that work for me. If you are developing your own pattern, I recommend watching my video on color blocking, which shows you a way on how to change your pattern to have stripes. So essentially the gist of that is starting with one pattern piece like this. So if you imagine that this was just one pattern piece, one large one, instead of individual stripes, and then you draw the stripes onto that, and you can do the same with the second one, measuring each piece along the way to make sure that the length along the side where you're going to join them is equal to your other pattern piece. So you would want to start by patterning your plush by making one large unstriped piece, making sure that pattern fits together the way you want, and then adding the stripes to that. But like I said, since I have a pre-made pattern, they've already done the hard work for me. I know that my pattern pieces line up exactly already. So what I needed to do was, since these pieces were too small in between to add my seam allowance to, I cut them out into individual pieces and then traced them onto another piece of paper and added the seam allowance around that and cut them out. So then I ended up with pieces like this, where it's the size of the pattern piece just with seam allowance added around the edges. Here's an example of a couple of the pieces that I cut out. I traced onto a new piece of paper and then added my own seam allowance, which is 1/4 inch, and then cut out those pieces. I also find it very helpful when you're working with stripes to mark the color that you're working with. So in my case, they alternate between mango and taupe. So I marked whether it was the side or the front, the order in which the stripe is. So this is 1, 2, and then it goes all the way down to 6. What color it is, and then as well the direction that the pile of the minky needs to run, which is super important with stripes because it's not always intuitive looking at the stripe which way the minky needs to run. So you need to make sure that your seam allowance is consistent, and this is where manually adding your seam allowance to the pattern itself can help you greatly, rather than just using the pattern without any seam allowance. So if you were to cut this out, draw it onto the minky, and then draw on your seam allowance around that, that can result in potentially a less accurate seam allowance than if you were to go ahead and make a pattern with your seam allowance instead. So this way I feel like you can more easily add a consistent seam allowance along your pattern piece rather than just doing it onto the minky itself. And that way, if you decide to make this plush again in the future, you already have your pattern ready to go. So when adding your seam allowance, just make sure that whatever seam allowance you decide to do, that it's consistent all the way around your pattern. So like I said, I do a 1/4 inch seam allowance, which I do freehand because I've been making plushies for 10 years, but if you're new, I would recommend using a measuring tape and manually measuring out a 1/4 inch every so often around your pattern piece and then connecting the dots between that. So once you have your pattern pieces ready to go, you can go ahead and cut them out of minky. So I took all these little pieces and traced them onto my 2 colors and ended up with pieces like this. So I traced these pieces directly onto the minky with seam allowance with a water-soluble fabric pen. I also marked on the back which pattern piece it is. So this is side 1, this is side 2. This will help you remember the order in which you sew them, because once you start cutting these tiny little stripes out, it can be very difficult to figure out what order they're going to go in. If you don't mark them, then you have to kind of match up your pattern pieces if you lose track. So I just find it easier to mark my pattern pieces as I go so I know exactly what order I need to sew them in. So then you need to pin these together along the seam where they're going to meet. So these pattern pieces are going to join along this side here. So we're just going to flip it over and then line up the edges. And pin them into place. So at this point, it's also important that you keep the edges lined up exactly as well. So it can be hard to see because it's so small, but you want your edges to be perfectly aligned at the very edge. So if I pin this and the brown was sticking out a little bit further than the mango, I'm going to end up with an inconsistent pattern piece. So now this stripe has become thinner than it was in the pattern. So now my piece is no longer going to match up when I sew it to the other side. So you just want to make sure that when you're pinning this together, that your edges line up exactly. So when I pin stripes together, I do actually use a lot of pins because it can shift around so much. I use a lot more pins than I typically would when sewing a piece together. As you sew minky, it tends to shift towards you as you sew down it and to kind of get out of place. So if you need some tips for sewing minky, you can check out my video on sewing minky, which I will also link. It has some useful tips in it. So I've gotten a little far off here at the edge, which is another thing you need to avoid. And if this happens, it helps if you actually start by pinning your edge here instead of going all the way down in a row. If you pin the edge, so you pin your end point and then ease the fabric between, which is just a way of saying to kind of make it fit. Then you'll get it to line up. Okay, so if you view it from both sides, you can see that the edges are even and nice and consistent. So now you can go ahead and sew this together along your top edge, making sure that you're using the appropriate seam allowance that was added to your pattern. This is another place where having a walking foot on your machine can really help, because it's going to help move this fabric along as you're sewing it, and because you really don't want your fabric to shift and move as you're sewing it, it's a really nice bonus to have that walking foot to help you get a more precise seam. So now you saw how many stripes were in this pattern. I get to sew all these little pieces together. So this is where sewing stripes can be kind of tedious and crazy, but it does have a very nice effect in the end. All right, so we're going to sew all of these together along our seam lines, and then we're going to have 3 pattern pieces. We're going to have a front, we're going to have 2 sides, and then we have to join those up so that our stripes match along the seams. So I've gotten all my stripes sewn together, and there's nothing really special about the way you're gonna do this. You're just gonna sew like normal. And again, if you need some tips on sewing minky, you can check out another one of my videos, which will have some tips that will help you do so. Just make sure that you're sewing along the seam allowance, and that the seam allowance you're using while sewing is the same amount that you used while making the pattern. The one thing I did do was press the seams. So I do this whenever I have a color change that is a seam in my plushies. I use my iron on the polyester setting and just gently press the seams in the direction that the minky goes. So since it's going down this way, I push the iron down, and I just want to press open these seams because it gives it a bit of a more professional look on this side, and it'll help define these stripes a little bit more. So you don't want to use too much heat because minky doesn't do too well with heat. It can melt it if you make it too hot, so just be conscious of how much heat you're applying. You just want to press them open just enough to define these seams a little bit more. So I did sew one side together already, and you can see how the stripes match up along this seam. So now we have to do this joining these 2 pieces together. So to get these stripes to line up, it's really just about being very conscious of how you pin this together. So I'm going to flip this over so I have right sides together, and right side is the pretty side, and then we're going to line up these stripes first and foremost. So even though the pattern starts to be sewn up here, I'm going to start by lining up these stripes. You want to keep in mind that you're not going to line up the very edge of the fabric. You need to line up where your seam allowance is, because even though most of the time this is going to be a very small amount, like a 1/4 inch, I've had patterns to where the stripes end up going in a different direction towards the very edge than it is on the seam line, where if I were to line up the stripe at the edge, then my seam itself would not match up. So one technique I have is that I will pinch the area where the seam allowance is, where the stripe meets, and then flip it out. Look to see where the stripe lands, and then adjust by kind of shifting my fingers until the stripe lines up. So if I just move my fingers a little bit, then I can get the stripe to line up. So if I continue pinching that in place and then pin that in place. So I don't always do this method, but when I have a difficult placement, I often do this method when I have an embroidered mouth that I have to line up over a seam. So where, for example, the middle of the mouth meets the side of the mouth, this shape can be a little weird sometimes. So I find that technique particularly useful for lining up mouth embroidery. But most of the time when I sew stripes together, I will line up the first stripe by opening up my fabric and looking to see how the colors line up where the seam is going to hit. So you can just eyeball where your seam would start according to whatever seam allowance you use. So I used about 1/4 inch, so I can just eyeball about 1/4 inch. If you aren't used to what this measurement looks like, you could potentially mark the right side of your fabric with a disappearing marker, one that dries with air. I would say not to use a water soluble one because those can stain your fabric a little bit too much. So if you just use one of the air drying ones, which tend to be not as potent, you can mark the actual seam itself. But for the most part, I just eyeball where the seam is going to land and make sure that my stripes have lined up at that point. So then I will flip it back over and then take a pin and actually pin where my seam would go. So I'm going to pin right along the seam line. And then you can flip it open and make sure that your stripe is lined up. So you can see here that this stripe is lined up. So obviously this is a bad position for a pin, because if you were to sew down this line, you would have to pull out this pin very early. So we'll repin this at the very end. The first thing you want to do is just to line up all your stripes with this method. So for the next stripe, I'm going to move the fabric until it aligns. I'm going to open it up to where I can see where my seam would be. Move the colors until they line up. Close the fabric. Take a pin and then pin along the seam. And I'm going to repeat that all the way down. So if we check on our stripes, you can see that they are lining up. This one at the bottom here is a little bit off, so I'm going to redo this one. Okay, that looks better. And if you find that you just can't get these to line up no matter what, the first thing you're going to want to check is to make sure that your stripes were sewn evenly. If they weren't sewn evenly and your seam allowance has gotten larger or smaller than you intended, then your stripes likely aren't going to line up. And then if you're confident that you sewed them well, then the next thing you would have to do is to check to make sure that your pattern was accurately made. Alright, so this one still isn't quite lining up, so I'm going to redo this one again. Alright, so then it looks like our stripes are lining up with that method that we just used. So now we have to fix this pin situation. So this is where I come in and then line up the rest of the pattern and pin it how I intend to sew it. So I'm going to start at the top now and pin towards the edge, which is how I normally pin my fabric, so that I can easily pull out the pins with my left hand as I sew. So when you get to an area where you have a vertical pin instead of a horizontal pin, what I do is I don't pull it out first, I leave it in, and then I pin through the seam line of the stripe through this area. And so I'm going to leave this in for a little bit more. I'm going to go to the next area. You'll probably have to pin between your stripes if you have too much room. So I'm going to add one pin here and then take out that one vertical one, because if I took it out too early, then the fabric might have shifted while I was pinning the next area. So now I'm going to do the same thing here, where I'm going to pin into the seam itself, pin right through where this vertical pin is hitting, and then move on. Okay, so that's about the area where I want to stop sewing. So now it's pinned to where I can go ahead and sew along this line. So I'm ready to sew along my seam line, and I'm going to start with a basting stitch. And a basting stitch is a longer stitch. I max out my stitch length at 5 millimeters, and I typically sew when I want to do a final stitch at 2.5. So you just want to do a longer stitch than you're usually going to do, because you want to be able to easily seam rip the seam if you go ahead and sew along your line and then your stripes don't line up. If you went ahead and did a tight stitch, then it's just going to take a longer time to get rid of that stitch and redo it, as opposed to starting with a basting stitch, making sure everything lines up, and then going over that with a normal length stitch. So I'm going to pull out my pins just as I'm about to sew over them, and you want to wait till the latest time possible, just so that you make sure that your positioning stays intact. That's one of the reasons I like having my pin head to the left, so I can easily grab them. so now we can check on our seam. So I flipped them right side out, and for the most part the stripes look good, but there are a couple that are off. One is this one right here. This one looks good. And then this one at the bottom here. So what I'm going to do is just seam rip the area where they got a little off, and this just might be because the fabric was shifting as I sewed it, because I pulled out the pins and the minky tends to push forward as you sew, or it could be just I potentially need to re-sew these stripes themselves, but I think I'd be able to get it with just another try. So I'm gonna try first to just re-sew this seam, and then if I still can't get it, I'll reevaluate my stripe sewing itself. So I can do my other method where I have it open and then line it up, but then pinch the seam itself to keep it in line, and then flip it back open and pin it in place. Let's do that with the bottom one. So I'm going to line up the colors. This one's pretty awkward because the pattern starts to curve at this area, so it's a little difficult to line up. Okay. Pinch and pin. Be careful not to pin yourself. Alright, so I'm going to redo this seam. I'm just going to baste over it one more time to double check that it lines up. So after that last fix, my stripes now look good. They all line up along the seam. So I can finish up this seam by going over my stitch line with my normal length stitch, which is a 2.5 millimeter stitch. And you want to just sew right over your basting line, because you know that your basting line did its job in lining up those stripes. So you don't want to accidentally go inside your basting line or outside of it. You want to sew exactly over your basting line with a normal length stitch. So I just went over my basting stitch with a normal length stitch and double checking that my stripes still line up, which is always something that you want to do. And they all still look good to me. So this method does take a lot of prep work and does a couple steps because you want to baste it first and then stitch it, but all the preparation is worth it because then it'll keep you from having to constantly redo seams in the future. So now I can go ahead and finish up this plush by doing the same technique on the back here, lining up these stripes, and then finish it up. And so here's our final product. All the stripes are lined up. They look nice and clean, and we don't have any big gaps in where they meet on the seam, and we're all done, and it looks really good. So again, if you guys would like to make this plush on your own, the pattern is by Owl's Tea Party, and I will link it in the description. So thanks for watching today, and I hope you guys learned something, and see you next time.